This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This is your host, Tim Link, and we've got a fun show. Very interesting. It's going to be a unique one. You know, we're not talking about dogs and cats in this one. We're talking about wild animals in this one, and a little bit of a novel coming up from author Ken Wells. So we're going to talk to Ken a little bit about his latest book, Swamp, and then we'll talk to him about his writing styles, because Ken's been doing this magic for quite some time, so I want to pick his brain a little bit while we're here. So everybody hang tight. We'll come back right after this commercial break. You're listening to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio.
How many of you have pets? My hand's raised. Now think about how lucky you are to have such a sweet little pet in your life, and that pet is lucky to have you too. But unfortunately, there are countless pets out there that don't have a home to call their own. However, Bob's from Skechers is trying to change that. So we developed Bob's for dogs and cats to help pets in need. With every purchase of adorable Bob's footwear or fun, stylish apparel, or even the cutest Bob's pet accessories, Skechers makes a donation to Petco Love to help save shelter pets. And with your help, we've already saved the lives of over 1 million pets and raised over $7 million. So while you're getting style and comfort with features like Skechers' famous memory foam cushioning, you're also helping to save an adorable pet in need and helping another lucky owner be connected with a future best friend and companion, because happiness is having a loving pet by your side. Find Bob's at a Skechers store, Skechers.com, select Petco locations, or wherever stylish footwear is sold.
Let's Talk Pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. Joining us today is author and writer Ken Wells, and his latest book is called Swamp. Ken, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be on.
Oh, well, we're pleased to have you on. We're excited about it. And I was doing a little teaser. You know, we do a lot of shows here on Pet Life Radio. And my show in particular, we talk to authors and writers and about various types of books. And a lot of times it's, either books about the history and the uniqueness and scientific minds of animals. And then the others are more of youth-oriented. And then we have novelists that talk about how the dog comes into your life and then leaves and then comes back again, and so on and so forth. But this novel, Swamped, is a little bit unique and interesting from the take of from what we do here on the Animal Rights Show. So tell us a little bit about the book without giving all the good bits away, and we'll take it from there.
Well, I grew up with one foot in the actual swamp down in southern Louisiana. My mom spoke Cajun French, and my dad was an expatriate from Arkansas who wandered from one swamp down to one that was bigger and better and decided to stay. So I grew up with 5 brothers, fishing and swamp stomping, and we lived on a little farm, and we had all manner of critters, that kind of stuff. Anyway, so this book takes place in this swamp, the Greater Atchafalaya, which at 1.4 million acres is, a rival to the Florida Everglades, much lesser known. It's full of all kinds of interesting critters, especially alligators, swamp bears, probably the Florida panther, 350 species of birds. Anyway, I decided I wanted to write a survival novel because my grandfather and I once were out in that swamp and broke down around dark, and happily a boat came along to rescue us because at about that time, a literal tornado of mosquitoes came up out of the marsh and were threatening to sort of take us away. So I kept thinking, what would it be like to really be stuck there with no food and, no water and no way to tell anyone that you've been lost? And so the setup is a precocious Cajun lad named Jack Landry, a high school senior, who learned swamp lore from his trapper Cajun grandfather. And he's been pretty much a swamp maven. And his skills are so impressive, the knowledge so impressive, that he gets a job on a weekend job touring as a tour guide for a high-end swamp tour company. And on Columbus Day weekend, a New York City philanthropist and his high school New York senior daughter, who is Harvard bound, fly in for the tour, and the plane goes down in the swamp, and the 2 kids are the only apparent survivor. And so young Jack has to figure a way to get them out of the swamp.
Wow. And that leads to all kinds of turmoils and interesting critters, as you say, that they run into. And the thing I liked about it is the fact that, this is your own personal knowledge. I'm assuming you're pulling from not necessarily a plane crash, but obviously living there and experiencing all this. How does that tie into the book as far as how much of real life experience is there compared to the fiction to make it all tie together?
Well, yeah, except for the plane crash, I didn't have to really make any of it up. My father was for a while the nuisance alligator hunter for Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. We grew up. My dad actually was the Boy Scout leader on our little bayou community, and we were out having a 5-mile hike in the marsh one day, and we spotted like a 7-foot gator when it was still legal to hunt alligators. And my dad went home and got a shooting iron, and the Boy Scout troop, captured a 7-foot alligator. So I have a lot of alligator experience, and so I had to put an alligator wrestling scene in this book because alligators are really interesting, and they're not nearly as aggressive as, say, the Australian saltwater crocodile. But in the wrong circumstances, they can hurt you. And I was fishing one time when I was in my early 20s before I left Louisiana. In this bayou, had been a drag line in there that built up this kind of mound on the bayou side. And as I came around that little bend by that mound, I spooked about a 6-foot gator, and he literally jumped over the top of my boat. I had no idea that alligators could do that. It was like seeing a dragon, flying through the air, and he made this humongous splash. And so, I have great respect for alligators. I also know an alligator secret. They have the biting power of a great white shark, but they have no power to open their jaws. So if you can grab them by the snout before they grab you, there's nothing they can do. A kid can hold like a 10-foot alligator's jaws shut.
Yeah.
Now, how you let it go is in different circumstances, but so all that lore went into the book.
Yeah, and how do you gather the courage to go up to the mouth of an alligator? That would
Well, there you go. That would be out of dire necessity. And of course, what happens in the book is that the Cajun lad manages to sort of build a life raft of life jackets, and then puts this young woman who's been knocked out and manages to swim to a place where there's high ground. And there's one problem: there's an 8-foot alligator occupying the high ground, and since there's no way for him to go back into the lake because he's exhausted, he realizes that he has to encounter the gator and get it to move because there's nothing else that they can do. So this sets up something that you would probably see on Swamp People, but anyway, it's.
You mentioned early on, rattle off some of these critters down there, and do they have a common name that other people would call them, or are they unique to the swamps?
Well, the Greater Atchafalaya has a reasonably interesting population of bears, and they are sort of biologically interesting because in one part of the swamp, they're actually separated from bears on the other side of the swamp. And I think they're in the process of trying to build a swamp overpass so that two types of bears can meet. There have been reported sightings of the Florida panther in the Greater Atchafalaya. The number of snakes there, one of my jobs when I was a lad out on the bayous there, we had a neighbor who was a live snake collector. She caught snakes and sold them to zoos and biological houses and collectors. And so for several summers, my brothers and I and my father were live snake collectors. And we have basically the canebrake rattlesnake. We have the cottonmouth, which is everywhere. It used to be everywhere. Probably 12 varieties of water snake. There's this red-bellied mud snake, which, it looks like some amazing artist painted it, and there's a lot of folklore involving that snake. It has a stinger on the end of its tail, which really doesn't sting you, but some of the old Cajuns believe that if that snake stings a live oak tree, the tree will die. So there was a lot of stuff growing up that they were telling us about that could make you leery about going into the Greater Atchafalaya.
So as a young man growing up, or a young boy growing up in the swamps, Was it a matter of this was just the way it was? I mean, that's how you learn and that's what you did? Or was it a matter of keeping up with dad and your siblings, your other brothers? And God bless your mother, a house full of boys.
Yeah, my mother was a saint. She really was a saint. And, no, it's what we did. My dad was and my grandfather were great. I call them outdoorsmen. They hunted and fished, but they had real reverence for the land, and they had a certain ethic. We never, took more than we could eat or give to other people to eat. We believed in conservation. And so, from the time I was 3 or 4, I just can remember, going out there and just loving being in the great outdoors. And by the way, we had this little farm, 5 or 6 acres, and I can't tell you the number of critters we had. I mean, I raised a pig named Petunia, and we had at one point we had 13 dogs, and 12 of them were rescue dogs because seriously, back then, this would have been in the early 60s. Townspeople would just drive out into the country and drop their dogs off if they didn't want them. And what we would do, we could never stand seeing a hungry or starving dog. So my dad would always say, "We're not taking this one in." And then my mother would say, "Oh, yes, we are." and then we'd take in another dog, So we had we ran out of names after a while, so we had so many dogs. But we loved it. We loved being around animals and growing up in the woods and hunting and fishing and that kind of stuff. So it was always part of my DNA, really.
Yeah, and I think you made some very valid points there in the fact that, first of all, very unique. I know each part of the country, just like different parts of the world, has their own unique animals, but the types of animals that are down in the bayou and the history and the length, almost like prehistoric at times, I would say, because you don't see these type of animals everywhere.
There's the alligator snapping turtle is an example of that. The big ones can grow to about 200 pounds. And, if you stepped on one accidentally, you could literally cut your leg off. And then they look like they have these spiky shells, and they really do look like a prehistoric creature. I mean, it's just astonishing. And another time we were in the boat going down the bayou in the Atchafalaya and felt a thump. And we looked behind us, and there was like a 6-foot paddlefish, which is another prehistoric creature that we had hit it. We didn't kill it or anything. It was just stunned, and it rolled up to the top of the water and shook its head at us and then went back down. But it was like seeing a dinosaur. You go like, wow, where did that come from? So it was interesting being out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I remember I will have to tell you one of my quick stories. And this is here in Georgia, up in the northern parts of Georgia. There was some construction clearing of the land going on. They're going to build a home development as they always do. And we had just torrential rains and mud everywhere around the area. And as I was leaving home one day, I saw something in the middle of the road, and I was in my car. So I pulled off and I got out and looked, and it was a snapping turtle. At first, it was, the shell was as big as a manhole cover.
Right.
It was that big. So I always tried to rescue the animals, take care of the animals. Didn't want to see anything happen to it. So I just, quietly, I had an idea what the turtle was, but I knew I had to be cautious. But I sort of got, behind it to a degree and grabbed a hold of the shell, and I was just going to gently move it over probably 1.5 feet to get it off the road. And he whipped around and tried to get me. And I was so scared that I flung him like a Frisbee toss. I checked on him later to make sure he was still okay, and he was. But those they're huge. They're huge, and they are scary looking, and they're very docile. But if you're in their domain or they feel threatened, that's a different story.
They are primordial in their view toward life, and it's either eat or be eaten. We had a lot of experience with them, and you don't want to get your finger anywhere near the mouth of a snapping turtle, because then you won't have a finger. I mean,
that's right. You'd be minus one finger. Absolutely. All right. Well, Ken, when people pick up a copy of the book Swamped, what's your goal? Once they're done and they thoroughly enjoyed it, of course, what do you hope they accomplish outside of that?
Well, strangely enough, it's kind of a Valentine to the ecosystem, even though this poor young couple of kids, they have an awful time, just trying to stay alive, and, weather that wants to kill them, and, encountering all these critters, in the worst possible situations. But then the more you think about it, young Jack Landry, the male protagonist, as he recounts to Olivia Fitzgerald, the Harvard-bound New York young woman, as he, kind of recounts his life in the swamp and why he loves it so much. And despite everything that, they go through, she begins to sort of see it through his eyes and realizes that, they're probably in the worst possible circumstances, but in better light, she would come to understand that, this really is one of America's magnificent ecosystems, and that the people who live in it and around it have a sort of preternatural attachment to it, perhaps deeper than they do in many places in America. It's the ecosystem is almost inseparable from the culture there. I think if, the secret subtext of the book, if I had one, would be that, I believe. That's
very good. I love that. When I was reading through the book, I was thinking about, it's very entertaining. It's unique. I can visualize it happening. I can visualize the critters as you describe them. But I love the fact that, as you just mentioned, it's an educational thing. You learn about the animals and the ecosystem, and how people, I think, that aren't familiar with that part of the country, they don't understand it or appreciate it necessarily. And this is a great learning experience while having an entertaining read.
Yeah, and again, about the second thing I do when I get back to Louisiana is, hop in my brother's boat, and, we're off to the Atchafalaya. And, these days, my brother's an avid crappie fisherman. There's a lot of crappie fishing, in the bayous there. But, I just go along and take my camera, and then I jump off out on the levees and, start photographing birds, and, try not to step on a cottonmouth or encounter a big alligator. But it's just a magnificent place to be. And the bird life there is stupendous. I can't tell you, we have a little place in Maine where my wife and I go every summer, and we have a beautiful little alpine lake. And once a year, a great blue heron shows up, and we're just like, oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. Look at that bird. Well, I was with my brother about 2 months ago in the swamp, and we probably motored maybe 8 or 10 miles down this one curvy bayou, and I counted something like 20 great blue herons.
Wow.
Well, not another one. It's like, how could that be? No, it's really an astonishing ecosystem, and the birds do very well there.
Very, very, very nice. All right, we're going to take a quick break. Then we'll come back and talk a little bit more to author and writer Ken Wells about the book Swamped. I also want to talk to Ken about his writing and writing styles, and his co-author. We want to give her a shout out too. So we'll come back right after this commercial break. You're listening to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio.
Sit. Stay. We'll be right back after a short pause. Well, 4 to be exact.
Take a bite out of your competition. Advertise your business with an ad in Pet Life Radio podcasts and radio shows. There is no other pet-related media that is as large and reaches more pet parents and pet lovers than Pet Life Radio. With over 7 million monthly listeners, Pet Life Radio podcasts are available on all major podcast platforms, and our live radio stream goes out to over 250 million subscribers on iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn, Stitcher, and other streaming apps. For more information on how you can advertise on the #1 pet podcast and radio network, visit PetLifeRadio.com/advertise today.
Let's talk pets.
Let's talk pets
On Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
Welcome back to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. Continue our conversation with author and writer Ken Wells. His latest book, Swamped. Fantastic read, very entertaining, and very educational. I found it very educational as well, so that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Now, Ken, you had an opportunity with this book to co-write with your lovely niece, Hillary Wells, who people may know as a writer, producer, a comedian, film industry. And I understand this is her first shot at the novel?
Yep. Well, what happened is when I originally started this book, I started out with the idea of writing a book for boys. And that's because boys, especially like middle grade boys, middle school boys, early high school boys, don't read in nearly the numbers or with the intensity as do girls. And one of the explanations for that is that, with kind of the feminization of literature, and I'm not saying that in a pejorative anyway, women are, read a lot more books, and therefore more books are produced for women and girls than boys. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to write an adventure story and one that, that boys sort of relate to. And so I do. And, and I conjure up this character, Jack Landry, who was some of me, but certainly not me. And then this, young woman from Manhattan who was Harvard bound. And, I was so eager to kind of make Jack the hero of the book that in the early iterations, the first drafts, what I call the ugly versions of my book, Olivia was sort of a thinly cast character. There just wasn't much to her because I was really sort of focusing on, sort of making this kind of a boy hero that boys could relate to. And that was the feedback. People would say, well, I like the plot, I like the swamp, I like your character, but that girl, there's just nothing to her. And by the way, she's not even very likable, So that was the feedback. And, this is how writers are, I stewed over that for a week or two or three. What do they know? So come on. But then I realized that was right, and so at the point where I decided that Olivia's character has to have a more fully formed, take in the story, I kept thinking, well, I'm a little removed from the teenager cohort, like I was a teenager in the Jurassic period. But my niece, Hillary, she and I had actually collaborated before. I wrote a cultural and social history of gumbo called Gumbo Live Tales from the Rue Bayou. And when that came out, Hillary was doing comedy in Hollywood, but also working around the fringes of Netflix on programs. And she actually took the book and pitched it and went and did a pilot, sort of pitching it as a sort of Cajun food program. And we never got a take on that, but I remembered, her taking the initiative. So just on a whim, I got in touch and said, I think I need your help. I want you to read this if you're willing to, and paying particular attention to the character Olivia Fitzgerald and the dynamic between the Jack and Olivia, which other people had said, well, I don't think this is how kids talk today. That was another thing, And I didn't know what she would say. She might have said, Uncle Ken, have you lost your mind? But no, said, let me see. And so she read it and she had some good verbal feedback. And so what we did is we traded the manuscript back and forth several times, using track changes, and ended up really getting together, I think, totally transforming Olivia's character and sort of totally transforming the dialogue and the relationship between the two kids. And as a result, I think it came out as a much better book. And it's a book now that I think both boys and girls and, adults as well, can relate to. So that was how that process worked out.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Pull on those resources, especially relatives if they owe you one. That's the key.
There you go. You work cheap. That was good. So.
Yeah, exactly. Any way you can get a freebie, we'll do it. So that's fantastic. So your background, I want to talk to you a little bit about the writing background in general, because, we know the novels and the great work there, but you had a very interesting writing career and editing career, 24 years with the Wall Street Journal and then another 6 years with Bloomberg Businessweek. Tell us about those, we'll call them the early days, and how does that contrast with what you're doing today, or maybe what can you pull from being a feature writer and editor for those publications into some of the work you do with your novels?
Yeah, well, I don't think I would have ever been a novelist without the discipline I learned as a journalist. And I started off actually on my little hometown weekly paper, and eventually worked my way to the Wall Street Journal. And it really was at the Journal where they had this love of feature writing, and they had a sort of a method of teaching you and schooling you on the art of feature writing, and I took to it pretty quickly. And it was astonishing. For a while I was in the San Francisco bureau, and we covered 8 states, including Alaska and Hawaii, and the Journal always had this little feature story on the middle of the front page. And I ended up writing a lot of those, and later as an editor on Page One, editing those. But it was a feature writer's paradise, because the Journal was fundamentally a business newspaper, but to sort of sweeten the pot for our business-centric readers, we always gravitated to these really entertaining, feature stories every day, 5 days a week on the front page. And it was something, one time I was in Anchorage, Alaska, coming back actually at the airport covering an oil and gas development, a very serious business story. And I overhear these guys in the bar, which is where I was too. We call that reporting from the Mahogany Ridge. I'm in the bar and I overhear these guys talking about they're headed to a golf tournament, and I said, well, where? I'm not really a golfer. They said, well, we're going to Kodiak Island. And I said, well, isn't that where the bears are? And, oh, yeah, Kodiak. What's this golf tournament about? This was like March, where it's still cold. I said, well, it's one whole par 200 up the side of a bear-infested mountain, and I said, okay. And so I called my editor and said, this is what these crazy people are doing. Should I go? And they said, yeah, get on a plane, go with them, and go write about that. So that's the kind of stories I was doing for the Journal. It was just, as a feature writer, it didn't get any better than that. It was a ton of fun. And then, you got to showcase your writing on the front page for, probably one of the premier, newspapers in all of America. So, but all that, taught me, the discipline of, meeting deadlines and, being very concise in your writing and sort of the fundamentals of how to really craft a good story. And out of that, because I had this very interesting sort of Louisiana background, it occurred to me that, boy, I've been doing journalism all these years, but, I ought to be able to write a novel, something interesting about my Louisiana upbringing. And I was sitting in the newsroom. I was on Page One. And the Page One staff was a little magazine staff within the paper. And I was sitting there one day looking around the newsroom and seeing all my esteemed colleagues. And this one had gone to Harvard, and this one to Yale, and this one to Princeton. And I realized that I was probably the only person in the entire paper who had ever skinned a possum, so well, surely I can make something of this, And so I began to write these little sort of vignettes, these kind of thinly veiled, encounters with real people and sort of writing them as short stories. And then one thing led to another. And I finally, after many years of trying, got my first novel published in the year 2000.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. That's the thing I love about it, in the fact that, as you mentioned, it's very, when you're on those tight timelines and crunches, it does teach you discipline and structure and these type of things. And that's, what you need when you're writing in any fashion. And then when you try to take that to writing a novel and like your work, I love your work and the fact that, here you are, a featured writer for, a daily publication. Now you're doing novels, but you've done nonfiction and you've done, the sort of the Cajun cookbook type thing, a little bit of everything. And I just love the fact that you're versatile enough to be able to move around from one area to another. And that can be very challenging.
It is, quite challenging, but it's also, exhilarating in a way. One of the things that journalism teaches you is to become a ruthless self-editor. You have to recognize when, your stories need fixing, and you have to be the person who understands how to get it. The joke about editing, it begins with a scalpel, it ends with a chainsaw. It's like...
Well, I love this fact that, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, is the fact that you spend all this time, as a editor, feature writer and editor for these publications. And then when you come back to doing your novels, and particularly this one, Swamped, editors come back and said, yeah, it's really good, but, what about this girl? What about this? And then you just have to step back and say, well, what's wrong with that girl? Then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I'm an editor. I should be able to catch these things right away.
Well, there you go. And that's why everybody needs an editor. Now, I will qualify to say that they need a good editor, but yeah, everybody needs an editor. And that's one of the things I learned in journalism, that, even I work with some of the best in the business. When I was on Page One, our little staff, I think the Journal won 9 Pulitzers in 7 years. And I was editor on 2 of those. And at this very high level, there's a lot of performance anxiety, but there's also just a lot of that's sort of brought to the craft, and you learn how to do this stuff. You really do. And then I think I brought that into my fiction writing as well, and especially the discipline to get to the end of a story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you did a fantastic job of that. Ken, where can people find out more about you, follow all your wonderful activities, pick up a copy of the book Swamped? Let's keep track of what's going on. Where can people find out about you?
I have a website. It's BayouBro, BayouBro.com. And Swamped is available nationwide. You can get it on Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, Bookshop.org. And if your local bookstore doesn't have it, tell them to order it, and they'll get it for you.
That's right. All right. Well, everybody would definitely pick up a copy of the book Swamped. It's fun. It's entertaining. It's, as you said, it's designed for the young adult fiction, but it's definitely an adult fiction book to me, with a lot of cool animals in there and even a love story. So we got to like that. All right. Well, Ken, thanks for coming on the show today. We really appreciate it. Everybody go pick up a copy of the book Swamped. You're going to be thoroughly entertained, and then we'll get posted Ken's website. You can find out all of his other wonderful writing and keep track of that as well and see what's going on with him. So, Ken, thank you so much for coming on the show. We look forward to it and look forward to chatting with you again somewhere down the road.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this. It's fun.
Absolutely. A lot of fun. Well, we're coming to the end of the show today. I want to thank everyone for listening to Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. I want to thank the producers and sponsors for making this show possible. If you have any questions, comments, ideas, or people you want to hear from on the show, drop us a line. You can go to PetLifeRadio.com. I'll be glad to answer your questions, entertain your comments, and bring on the people you want to hear from most. And while you're there, check out all the other wonderful shows and hosts and entertainment. It's a cornucopia of fun and a whole lot of animal talk, so it's really good. So everybody go to PetLifeRadio.com. So until next time, write a great story about the animals in your life, and who knows, you may be the next guest on Animal Rights on Pet Life Radio. Have a great day.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.